As the morning rush picked up, Evelyn stood by the kitchen doors for a moment, watching everything unfold. The clatter of pans, the sizzle of food on the grill, the hum of conversation, it was all the same, yet it felt new. This was her restaurant. Her team. And from this moment on, things would be different. She turned to her mother. "So, any chance you'll take that real job offer?" Martha smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "I think I've done what I came here to do. But I'll always be around. Someone has to make sure you don't let these investors push you around." Evelyn laughed, shaking her head. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As the day went on, the restaurant filled with the usual energy, but with something extra, a sense of hope, of renewal. The staff worked together, knowing they were part of something bigger than just a job. And as customers walked through the doors, greeted by warm smiles and the smell of something delicious cooking in the kitchen, one thing was clear. This was more than just a restaurant. It was a family. And no investor, no arrogant chef, no outside pressure could ever take that away. Martha nodded. "And do you think those things happen when employees are afraid to come to work? When a chef treats people like they don't matter? When customers can sense the tension in a place instead of feeling welcome?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if realizing he didn't have an easy answer. "This restaurant isn't just about making money," Martha continued. "It's about people. The people who cook the meals, who serve the guests, who make this place feel like home. My daughter understands that. That's why she built this place from the ground up." Evelyn felt a lump rise in her throat. She hadn't expected her mother to speak up, but she was grateful for it. The investor sighed, flipping through his notes one last time before tucking the clipboard under his arm. "All right," he said finally. "I'll report back to the board. But just know, they'll be watching closely." Evelyn nodded. "Tell them to come in for dinner sometime. They'll see exactly why this place works." With that, the man gave a small nod and walked out, leaving the restaurant in a stunned silence. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, one of the line cooks, a young man named Miguel, let out a small laugh. "Well," he said, shaking his head, "that was intense." Lily, the waitress who had been worried about Martha the night before, smiled. "Yeah, but I think we'll be okay." Evelyn exhaled, finally allowing herself to relax. She turned to her mother, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. "You didn't have to do that." Martha chuckled. "Of course I did. Someone had to remind him what really matters." The staff slowly returned to work, the tension finally easing from the air. There was still a lot to do, but something felt different now. Lighter. Like the weight of the past had finally lifted, and they could all move forward. Evelyn's heart pounded. She had handled Marco. She had taken back control. But now, standing in front of this man, she realized something. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Evelyn's stomach tightened as she looked at the man in the suit. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she refused to let it show. She had spent years building this restaurant, and she wasn't about to let some corporate investor tell her how to run it, especially not after everything that had just happened. Martha watched her daughter closely, recognizing the familiar look of quiet determination on her face. She had seen Evelyn fight through challenges before, and she knew her daughter wasn't one to back down. The man adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Ms. Sinclair, given the recent changes in management, the board has concerns about the restaurant's long-term stability. We need to ensure that the business remains profitable under your leadership." Evelyn crossed her arms. "This restaurant has always been profitable. And now, without a toxic kitchen environment, I expect it to do even better." The man hesitated, flipping through his clipboard as if searching for the right response. "That may be true, but investors need reassurance. They want to see a solid plan moving forward. Otherwise, they may reconsider their involvement." A tense silence filled the room. The staff exchanged worried glances. They had just seen Marco leave, believing that was the biggest shift the restaurant would face. Now, there was another threat looming, one that could change everything. Martha, standing quietly in the background, finally stepped forward. Her voice was steady, filled with the kind of wisdom that only comes from experience. "Tell me something, young man," she said, looking directly at the investor. "What makes a restaurant truly successful?" The man hesitated, caught off guard. "Well, profitability, of course. Growth. Reputation." Marco swallowed hard. "I deserve that," he admitted. I never thought it would end like this." Evelyn's voice remained steady. "Actions have consequences, Marco. And this restaurant will be better without the fear you brought into it." Marco didn't argue. He simply unfastened his apron, set it down on the counter, and walked toward the door. But just as he reached the exit, he stopped. Without turning around, he spoke, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard before. "For what it's worth," he said, "your mother is an incredible woman." Then, he was gone. A weight seemed to lift from the room, but before anyone could celebrate, Evelyn raised a hand. "We're not done." Murmurs spread through the staff. What else was coming? Evelyn exhaled slowly, gathering her thoughts. "This restaurant has been successful, but at a cost. I let someone like Marco run this kitchen for too long because I was too focused on numbers. That changes today." She turned, looking at each of her employees. "From now on, this kitchen will be a place of respect. Hard work, yes. High standards, absolutely. But fear and humiliation? Never again." A ripple of relief spread through the staff. Some of them had been waiting years to hear those words. Then, Evelyn looked at Martha, her expression softening. "And as for you?" Martha raised an eyebrow. "Yes." Evelyn smiled. "I know you didn't take this job because you needed it. But if you ever want a real position here, one where you don't have to wash dishes, you have it." Martha chuckled. "I'll think about it." But just as the room seemed to settle, the final twist came. The restaurant's front doors swung open, and a man in a suit walked in, holding a clipboard. He scanned the room before his eyes landed on Evelyn. "Ms. Sinclair?" Evelyn frowned. "Yes." The man stepped forward, lowering his voice. "I'm with the investor group. We have one more issue to discuss. It's about your restaurant's future." A hush fell over the room again. The real fight was just beginning. The next morning, the restaurant felt different. There was a strange quietness, a tension lingering in the air that no one could quite place. Whispers had already spread among the staff, about Marco, about the owner's mother, about the things that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. Everyone knew something big was coming, but no one knew exactly how it would unfold. Evelyn arrived earlier than usual, stepping into the kitchen with a clear purpose. She had spent the entire night thinking, replaying every moment, every detail. This wasn't just about Marco anymore. This was about the restaurant, about the kind of place she wanted it to be. Marco was already there, standing stiffly near the prep station. He looked exhausted, like a man who hadn't slept at all. When Evelyn met his gaze, there was no arrogance left in his eyes, only a quiet acceptance of whatever was coming next. Martha had also come in early, though she wasn't at the sink this time. Instead, she stood off to the side, watching carefully, her expression unreadable. She hadn't needed to say anything. She had already done what she came to do. Now, it was Evelyn's turn. Evelyn took a deep breath. "Marco," she said evenly, making sure every staff member could hear. "I've made my decision." A heavy silence fell over the room. The younger cooks paused mid-task, the servers near the doorway held their breath. Even Marco straightened slightly, bracing himself. "You're fired," Evelyn said, the words calm but firm. Marco closed his eyes for a brief second, then nodded. No protests, no arguments, just quiet resignation. Maybe, deep down, he had seen this coming long before last night. "I've already spoken to the investors," Evelyn continued. "They've approved the decision. You will be removed from the restaurant immediately." A few gasps echoed in the room. The reality of the moment was sinking in. Marco, the man who had ruled this kitchen for years, was gone. Marco swallowed hard. "Because I never thought I'd be on the other side of it." He exhaled, running a hand over his face. "After I left the office, I checked my phone. There was an email from corporate." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "What email?" Marco looked at her, his jaw tightening. "The investors. They've been looking into your restaurant. Into me." He let out a bitter chuckle. "Apparently, customer satisfaction surveys don't just focus on the food. They look at how staff morale affects service. And guess what? Someone's been talking." Evelyn's breath caught. Marco shook his head. "It's not just you who's deciding my future here, Evelyn. The investors already are." The weight of his words sank in. Evelyn had been prepared to fire Marco herself, but now she realized the situation was bigger than she thought. If the investors had been looking into complaints about him, it meant that this problem wasn't just about one night or one person. It was about the entire restaurant. Martha, ever observant, simply smiled. "Like I said," she murmured, "life has a funny way of humbling people." Marco didn't argue. He didn't have it in him anymore. For years, he had built his reputation on power and fear. Now, it was all unraveling. Evelyn took a slow breath. "I need to think," she said, repeating the words she had told him earlier. "But whatever happens, Marco, know this, you don't get to decide the future of this kitchen anymore." "I do." Marco gave a small, defeated nod before turning and walking away. Evelyn watched him go, her mind spinning. This wasn't just about one decision anymore. This was about the future of everything she had built. Martha patted her daughter's hand. "You'll figure it out." Evelyn nodded, but as she stared at the now empty hallway, she realized one thing. Martha wiped her hands one last time, then turned to her daughter. "It's late," she said with a knowing smile. "I think it's time for me to head home." Evelyn nodded, her expression softening just slightly. "I'll walk you out." As they stepped out of the kitchen and into the quiet hallway leading to the back exit, Evelyn glanced at her mother. "You planned this, didn't you?" Martha chuckled. "I just wanted to see what kind of man you had leading your kitchen." Evelyn exhaled sharply, shaking her head in disbelief. "You could have just told me. Would you have believed me?" Martha asked gently. Evelyn hesitated. She wanted to say yes, but deep down, she knew the truth. She had turned a blind eye to Marco's arrogance for years because the restaurant was thriving. She had excused his behavior because customers raved about his food. But now, standing here, watching her mother smile as if none of this had ever bothered her, Evelyn realized she had been making excuses for too long. They reached the back door, and Martha turned to face her daughter. "I trust you'll make the right decision." Evelyn nodded, but before she could say anything, a voice interrupted. "Wait." Both women turned to see Marco standing a few feet away, his face unreadable. He had clearly been waiting for them. Evelyn tensed, immediately stepping between her mother and the man who had spent the entire evening disrespecting her. "Marco, whatever you have to say, it can wait until tomorrow." "No, it can't," he said, his voice lower than before. There was something different about his tone, not anger, not arrogance. Something else. Martha studied him, her eyes sharp but calm. "Go on, then." Marco hesitated. For the first time in a long time, he looked unsure of himself. "I messed up," he finally admitted. I know that. I should have treated you with respect. I should have treated everyone with more respect. Evelyn crossed her arms. And now you're realizing that? Martha chuckled softly, wiping her hands dry. Life has a funny way of humbling people. Lily hesitated, then leaned in slightly. Can I ask you something? Martha nodded. Why did you do this? I mean, why work here? You could have just told Evelyn what Marco was like. She would have believed you. Martha smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. Some lessons have to be learned the hard way. Lily let that sink in. At that moment, the door to the office creaked open. Every head in the kitchen turned as Marco stepped out. His face was unreadable, his movements stiff. He didn't say a word. He just walked past everyone, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The silence in the kitchen deepened. The way he moved, it wasn't the confident stride of the chef they had known. It was something else. Something uncertain. A few seconds later, Evelyn emerged. She surveyed the room, her gaze landing on her mother. Martha gave her a small nod. Evelyn nodded back. And just like that, the night had shifted. Something big was coming. The staff could feel it. And Marco? For the first time in his career, he didn't know if he still had a place in this kitchen. The tension in the kitchen didn't ease. If anything, it grew thicker, pressing down on everyone like a weight they couldn't shake. Marco's departure left an eerie silence in his wake, as if the very air had shifted. Some of the younger chefs exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what was happening behind the scenes. They had never seen their head chef look anything less than confident, and now he looked like a man on the edge of losing everything. Evelyn remained standing at the center of the kitchen, her presence commanding attention without a single word. She was never one for public displays of power, but tonight was different. Tonight, she needed everyone to understand that things were changing. You assumed she was just some nameless dishwasher, someone beneath you. Marco exhaled sharply, struggling to find words. Evelyn, listen, I had no idea she was your mother. If I had known. That's the problem, Evelyn snapped, her patience finally thinning. It shouldn't have mattered who she was. It shouldn't take personal connections for you to treat someone with basic respect. Marco swallowed, his chest tightening. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what to say. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath. Tell me something, Marco. Do you think you're irreplaceable? His eyes flickered with something, fear, maybe. He knew what was coming. Look, I love this restaurant. I've given everything to this place. I've built this kitchen into something people respect. You know that. And yet, Evelyn said, tilting her head, you forgot that I built this restaurant. You may run the kitchen, but I run everything else. The truth of her words hit him hard. He had always thought of himself as untouchable. The head chef. The one who made the magic happen. But now, standing in front of her, he realized just how vulnerable he really was. I need time to think, Evelyn said, tapping her fingers lightly on the desk. But I can tell you one thing for certain. Marco's stomach twisted. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear what she was about to say. This restaurant will go on, with or without you. The words landed like a punch to the gut. Marco's breath came shallow, his mind racing. Outside the office, the kitchen was still buzzing with whispers. The tension from earlier hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown heavier in Marco's absence. Martha stood at the sink, finishing up the last of the dishes. Her movements were slow, steady, unbothered. Lily hovered nearby, still in awe of everything that had unfolded. You're really something, you know that? Lily finally said, shaking her head. I don't think I've ever seen Marco look that shaken. The room was so silent that even the faintest sounds of the restaurant outside seemed deafening. Marco hesitated for a split second, then nodded stiffly. Yes, ma'am. Without another word, Evelyn turned and walked toward the back office. Marco followed, his usual confidence now replaced with the heavy weight of regret. As the two disappeared, the rest of the kitchen staff slowly exhaled. Lily turned to Martha, her eyes wide. That was incredible. Martha simply smiled, picking up her towel. Oh, sweetheart, she said softly. This was just the beginning. Inside the office, the air was thick with tension. Marco stood near the door, his hands clasped together, his jaw tight. Evelyn took a seat behind her desk, staring at him with an unreadable expression. The weight of the moment was suffocating. He had been in high-pressure situations before, but nothing quite like this. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch, watching as Marco shifted uncomfortably. He had spent years controlling the kitchen, commanding respect through fear and intimidation. But now, for the first time, he wasn't in control. I want to understand something, Marco, Evelyn finally said, her voice quiet but firm. Why do you think you can treat people the way you do? Marco blinked. I don't. Evelyn raised a hand, cutting him off. Let me be clear. This isn't just about my mother. I've seen how you run my kitchen. I've heard the complaints. But I let it slide because you deliver results. Because customers love the food. Because, up until tonight, I thought you were tough, but fair. Marco's throat tightened. He could feel the floor slipping out from under him. But now, Evelyn continued, leaning forward slightly, I see exactly who you are. You don't just demand excellence, you humiliate people. You break them down, make them feel small. And the worst part? You didn't even bother to know the woman you were disrespecting. Yes, and in that time, I've made sure this kitchen runs like a well-oiled machine, Marco said, his confidence returning. I expect efficiency from my team, and when someone isn't pulling their weight. Like my mother? Evelyn interrupted, her voice calm but firm. The entire kitchen froze. For the first time since she walked in, Marco looked completely caught off guard. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Martha continued washing dishes, as if she hadn't just been at the center of the most shocking revelation of the night. Marco blinked, shaking his head slightly, as if trying to process what he had just heard. I'm sorry, did you say, your mother? Evelyn nodded, taking another step closer. Yes. My mother. The color drained from Marco's face. He glanced at Martha, then back at Evelyn, suddenly realizing the weight of his words from earlier. The kitchen staff exchanged glances, some of them barely holding back their expressions of shock. Lily looked relieved, as if justice was finally about to be served. Marco started, then stopped, visibly struggling for words. I didn't know. No, Evelyn said, her tone sharp. You didn't. For the first time that evening, Marco was speechless. His usual arrogance had vanished, replaced with something closer to panic. Martha finally turned off the faucet and set the last plate down to dry. Then, she turned to face Marco fully for the first time. She didn't look angry. She didn't even look smug. If anything, she looked exactly the same as she had all night, calm. I didn't expect special treatment, she said gently. I just wanted to see how things worked here. And now, I have. Marco's throat bobbed as he swallowed, clearly unsure of how to respond. Evelyn let the silence stretch once more before speaking again, her voice controlled but carrying undeniable authority. Chef Marco, I think we need to have a discussion. In my office. Now. Maybe I should stop worrying about keeping this kitchen running because someone can't keep up. Is that what you're suggesting? Lily swallowed hard. No, I just. But before she could finish, Evelyn spoke. Is there a problem here? The kitchen went still. The usual clatter of pots and plates seemed to fade into silence as everyone turned toward the voice. Marco frowned and glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see one of the managers. Instead, his expression shifted slightly when he saw Evelyn standing there, arms crossed, her face unreadable. "Ms. Evelyn," he said, quickly adjusting his tone. "I wasn't expecting you tonight. I can see that." Her voice was even, but there was something beneath it, a quiet authority that made even the most seasoned employees tread carefully. Marco cleared his throat. "We're just having a little issue with," he glanced toward Martha, his irritation returning. "The new hire." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Is that so?" Marco sighed, clearly trying to remain composed. "Look, I don't mean to be harsh, but this is a high-pressure environment. If someone can't keep up, it slows everyone down. I have to think about the restaurant." Evelyn studied him for a moment, letting his words hang in the air. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Martha, still standing at the sink, finally turned slightly, wiping her hands on a towel. She met Evelyn's eyes, and for a brief second, something unspoken passed between them. Then, she turned back to the dishes, continuing as if nothing had happened. Evelyn let the silence stretch just long enough to make Marco shift uncomfortably. Then she took a slow step forward. "You've been working here for how long now, Chef Marco?" "Almost 5 years," he answered quickly, straightening his posture. 5 years. She nodded, tapping her fingers lightly against her arm. "That's a long time." A slow, burning anger began to rise in her chest. She watched as Marco threw another glare in Martha's direction. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. "Maybe this job is too much for you, huh? Maybe you should think about retirement instead of slowing the rest of us down." Evelyn's fingers curled into a fist at her side. She knew Marco was arrogant. She knew he was harsh. But this? This was something else. He had no idea who he was speaking to. He had no idea that the woman he was humiliating was the very reason this restaurant even existed. Martha, as always, remained calm. She glanced at Evelyn but didn't react. She had known her daughter would find out eventually. And that was exactly what she wanted. Evelyn took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay composed. She wasn't going to explode in the middle of the kitchen. No, she was going to handle this the right way. But one thing was certain. Marco's night was about to take a turn he never saw coming. Evelyn steadied herself, inhaling slowly to keep her emotions in check. This wasn't the time for an outburst. She had spent years building a reputation as a leader who commanded respect without ever raising her voice. But right now, seeing her mother, being treated like nothing more than an inconvenience made it difficult to hold back. She stepped further into the kitchen, her heels clicking against the tile floor. A few of the staff noticed her presence and straightened up immediately. Marco, however, was still too focused on his own frustration to realize she was there. Martha continued working, her hands moving methodically, her face unreadable. She could feel her daughter's presence now, but she gave no indication of it. Lily, still standing nearby, finally found the courage to speak. "Chef Marco, maybe you should." "I should what?" Marco cut her off, turning on her with an impatient glare. And, in truth, she wasn't slow, she was steady, precise. But Marco didn't care about that. He only cared about control. Martha simply let the words pass over her. She had met men like Marco before, men who mistook cruelty for strength, who believed that barking orders and putting others down made them important. She had seen it all before. And she knew exactly how this was going to play out. One of the waitresses, a young woman named Lily, hesitated before stepping closer to Martha. She lowered her voice. "Do you need a break? I can bring you some water." Martha gave her a kind smile. "That's sweet of you, dear, but I'm just fine." Lily nodded but still looked uneasy. It wasn't fair, watching Marco treat her like this. But Martha's calmness made her wonder, why wasn't she affected by his words? Most people would have quit by now. Most people would have at least argued back. But Martha just kept working, as if she knew something no one else did. Meanwhile, in the front of the restaurant, the owner was arriving. The staff knew her as Evelyn, a woman in her late 30s, always dressed with effortless elegance, always carrying herself with quiet confidence. She wasn't the kind of owner who just sat in an office. She had built this restaurant from the ground up, and she cared deeply about every part of it. Tonight, she had arrived later than usual. Meetings had kept her busy, but as she stepped inside, she immediately sensed that something felt off. The energy in the kitchen was tense, more than usual. She walked past the dining area, greeting a few guests along the way, before making her way toward the back. As she reached the kitchen, she stopped in her tracks. Her heart dropped. There, standing at the sink, was her mother. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't been told that her mother had taken a job here. And from the way Marco was towering over her, his expression full of irritation, she could tell exactly what was happening. The kitchen was alive with the sizzling of pans, the clatter of plates, and the sharp voices of the staff calling out orders. It was a busy night at Maison Elite, one of the most talked about restaurants in town. The scent of fresh herbs and seared meat filled the air, mixing with the faint aroma of dish soap coming from the back. Every worker moved with urgency, each playing their part in keeping the place running smoothly. But amidst the hustle, a scene was unfolding that no one expected. Faster. I don't have all night. Chef Marco barked as he tossed a pile of greasy pans into the sink. His voice carried a sharp edge, filled with irritation. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a commanding presence. Known for his skill in the kitchen, he had a reputation for running things with an iron fist, and for his impatience. Standing at the sink was an elderly woman, her hands submerged in soapy water as she scrubbed away at the endless stream of dishes. Her name was Martha. With her short, silver-streaked hair tucked beneath a plain blue bandana, she moved with a quiet resilience, undeterred by the harsh treatment she received. She had just started working here a few days ago, and it was clear from the beginning that Chef Marco didn't respect her. "Are you even listening?" "I said hurry up," he snapped again, his voice rising above the noise of the kitchen. Martha didn't respond right away. She simply kept working, rinsing off a plate before placing it on the drying rack. She had been in kitchens before, seen chefs like Marco before, men who mistook authority for superiority. "Unbelievable," Marco muttered under his breath. He turned to one of the sous chefs and smirked. "You'd think after all these years, she'd at least know how to wash a dish properly." A few of the younger staff members exchanged uneasy glances. Some of them wanted to say something, but they knew better. In Marco's kitchen, speaking up meant putting a target on your back. Martha, however, didn't flinch. She knew who she was. She knew why she was here. What Marco didn't know, what no one here knew, was that she wasn't just another dishwasher. She wasn't here because she needed a job. She was here for a reason much bigger than scrubbing plates. And soon, the whole restaurant was going to find out. The night carried on, and the kitchen only grew louder. Orders kept rolling in, and the pressure mounted with every passing minute. Chef Marco, as usual, kept his voice sharp and his temper short. He stormed through the kitchen, throwing orders left and right, making sure everyone knew who was in charge. But no matter how much chaos surrounded her, Martha continued washing dishes with quiet patience. Every now and then, a few of the younger staff members glanced her way. They could see how Marco treated her, how he rolled his eyes, how he made snide remarks under his breath, how he acted as if she was invisible. It was uncomfortable to watch, but no one dared to intervene. Marco had built a reputation for being ruthless, and standing up to him usually meant losing your job. Martha, however, remained calm. She wiped her hands on a small towel tucked into her apron and reached for another dish. Her hands, aged and worn, carried the stories of a lifetime spent working. But this wasn't just any job. She had chosen to be here. Marco, oblivious to who she really was, saw her as nothing more than an old woman in the way. He didn't bother learning her name. To him, she was just another dishwasher, another disposable worker who could be replaced in an instant. Seriously, do you not understand how to keep up with a rush? Marco scoffed as he slammed another tray of dirty dishes into the sink. This is a restaurant, not some slow-paced diner where you can take your sweet time. A few of the line cooks tensed at his words. They knew Martha was doing her best.